So over to you, Mike.
Alrighty. Good afternoon. I'm Mike Stewart, and with me are Tom Pickering and David McLean from the Winning Thinking team. David is a former Royal Marine, a senior psychotherapist who consults to major corporations and is an expert in managing fear in very adverse situations. Tom is vastly experienced as a business leader with a track record of helping businesses with serious challenges rapidly achieve resolution and certainty. And in these situations, winning thinking is absolutely key. Today we're considering the new normal in relation to investment. And so I'd just like to ask Tom to please introduce our guests, Jim Waite and David Allen.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. First of all, apologies, we started a bit late, guys. And I'd also like to thank the guests for joining us. There's a very supportive group of guests which are following this theme and find this useful. So thank you very much for that. The second thing I'd like to say is this is very much a down-to-earth talk as well. So it's about really trying to get to grips with the new now and actually what are people practically doing about this. I'm delighted to introduce Jim Waite, who's a guy who I know and trust and I've done work with in the past, and a lot of time for Jim, both in terms of his professional background, but his insight and clarity on getting to the money and resolving difficult situations. So over to you, Jim. If you could summarise your thoughts on the new now as you find it, and your thoughts on investment, please, if that's okay.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for your kind words. Just 30 seconds on who we are. But so I run a firm called WPC, or Waite Partners Capital, to give it its full name, and technically we're private equity investors, but we call ourselves operational investors. So we're a mixed team of operators and investors. And context to some of the things that I'm about to say, we're very sector focused. So we do certain things in consumer, we do certain things in healthcare, but we pretty much don't look at anything else. So anything I say about anything else will be somewhat secondhand. And we very much work with small end companies. So, we're about, think of Blackstone, think of the opposite, and that's who we work with. So Tom asked me to talk about the new now. And also where investors should be investing and placing their bets. So why don't I start with the new normal? And at risk of disappointing the audience, personally, I think it's a little early to tell what the new now is. I think we're, whatever it is, 6 weeks, 7 weeks into this, and we're all still somewhat finding our way. We've got I can talk about what we found with our businesses. We've got a portfolio of 4, which I think covers pretty much the spectrum that we're seeing from other places. So we've got a bars business. You've probably all read in the papers that hospitality in its entirety and non-food retail will account for most of the 6 million people who are currently on furlough. So that business, we've strip the cash burn back to the absolute bare minimum so that we preserve it in a way that we can come out of hibernation when we're allowed to, but that we burn as little cash as possible in the short term. And I think that's the general rule that, speaking to other operators, that people are trying to do in those industries. We've got another investment, which is a group of care homes that look after a very specialised group of elderly people who've got severe mental health conditions. And they're also in about as much stress as you could get, but a different kind of stress. We've had a good pandemic, and that we've had very, very low infection rates, but as you can imagine, it's the stress levels for those people, the 300 people in that business have gone through the roof. And then we've got 2 other businesses, both of which are pretty much unaffected. by the pandemic. They're just carrying on as they previously were. One's a bit above budget, the other one's on budget, and it's the call centres have had to become virtual call centres, and there's been a lot of operational nitty gritty to get done. But actually, business-wise, they've continued pretty much as they are. And that sort of mix that we've got is consistent with what I hear speaking to other people that do what we do. You occasionally come across a booming business. Maybe they're making hand sterilizer or PPE or something like that. But generally speaking, you can be in an awful part of the economy, or you can be in something which is actually okay. I'm trying to look forward in the remainder of my 5 minutes, Tom, to what might come down the line. I've gone through, showing my age slightly, gone through 2 recessions now, and certainly what happened after the financial crisis is that our kind of healthcare, so healthcare services, care homes, and that kind of thing, was largely untouched. Some businesses got themselves into lender difficulties, but the lenders were very reticent to pull the plug on those kind of businesses, because reputation was more important than being seen to tip a few hundred vulnerable people out onto the streets. I'd expect broadly the same to happen this time. I can see some parts of the care home industry closing and never coming back, but they were, it's probably just accelerated things that would have happened anyway. I do hear early conversations about some forced sellers. So maybe it's a hospitality group where they've got down to a minimum cash burn, but the cash burn's not zero because it isn't for anyone. And somehow they need to make sure they've got enough cash to get through the months in the first couple of years to come, with reduced revenue through social distancing. So maybe they'll take one of their 10 assets and sell that to make sure that the other 9 keep going or something. So that's if that plays out the way people are talking about it, that will create some opportunities for investors, I think. But I think my overriding message on that kind of thing it would be quite hard to predict who the winners and losers are. And I'll tell you a little story just before I stop about the way you hear some restaurant and bar people talking about it. So they'll say, well, social distancing, that's going to restrict capacity. So a restaurant with half the number of tables in it, that won't be profitable. So a bunch of restaurants will shut or they never reopen. So restaurants are a disaster. Then the next person says, well, hang on a minute, the demand that's still going to be out there, because everyone eventually is going to go back, then if half the restaurants shut, then the other restaurants are going to be twice as busy. So restaurants are exactly the thing you should go into. And then the first guy says, well, the third guy pops up maybe, and he says, well, the ones that were shut, unless they've been repurposed and stopped being restaurants and they've started being, I don't know, supermarkets or something, then the landlord's going to find another restaurant operator and they're going to open up in that now empty restaurant that was very nicely fitted out by some private equity funded casual dining firm a few years ago. And you're going to be back to the same capacity you started with. And, that sounds almost like a ridiculous story, but those are the conversations that people are having. And I just tell it by way of it's actually quite difficult to see how what the second, third and fourth order effects of some of these things will be, and so how things will pan out. And I'll skip the detail of it, but in some parts of the pub industry, the last 10, maybe 15 years, we've lived that kind of transition.
Yeah.
I'm over my 10 minutes, Tom.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, it's great. So some of those businesses, Jim, where there's maybe more uncertainty, what are you specifically trying to do in terms of defining the new now to prepare the pull bar business that you've got to hit the ground running? What sort of actions are you taking? operationally?
Well, actually, number one was strip spending back to the bare minimum.
Yeah.
So that the cash we've got gives us as long a runway as possible, without being so short-termist that it would kill the business and make it impossible to bring it back out again. But whilst that sounds like a trade-off, 95% of the time we've erred towards the first one of those. So you've heard a million people say it over the last little while. Cash is king at the moment. And then what that has moved into is probably two main things. Operationally, trying to work out how with social distancing you make the sites operate. So we've had people in the sites measuring out, almost literally walking around with 2-meter circles, working out how many of our pool tables you'd be able to have operating at one time, because if you have the adjacent tables operating, then you're within the 2-meter rule. So we've worked out that with 2 or 3 people per table, you can have about half of the pool tables operating. And then you take that and we track utilization by literally minute, but we tend to look at it in hours over the course of the opening times through the week, and then we cross that so we cross the first exercise with what utilization is through the week to see how much of our capacity we can usefully use through our peak trading period. And actually it turns out that we can use we can achieve pretty much very close to the same occupancy coming out as we were achieving anyway. So that's sort of the operational exercise. There's some other stuff like people working behind the bar and not being too close together, people in the kitchen not too close together, but our places have quite low levels of staffing, a bit like cinema type staffing. So you don't, lots of space and not many people, you don't get into the staffing issues that you'll have heard busy restaurants talking about, for example. And then the other half of it has been trying to learn from other people's experience what coming out of lockdown might look like post reopening. You almost start at, you open the door, you assume everyone will just show up. You go through the exercise I was just talking about. You say, oh, actually, no, maybe it won't be quite so many people. But then you look at how things are ramped up in, for example, China. And for anyone in any business that's affected by, there's certainly analyst reports out there that from people like Goldman and Morgan Stanley and others that are trying to track what the early days of post-lockdown are in different parts of China. And so you then try out of that to guesstimate how long it will take your business to build back, and as a result, what level of costs you can afford, what level of profit or loss you'll be in over a time period, and therefore if you need to inject more funding, which we expect we will need to, how much that will be.
Yeah, that's really clear. Thank you very much, Jim. I think certainly pool bar is probably the first place I'll be going. I'm a bit of a, and it's a sign of a misspent youth, I think, a pool bar, wherever you go in the world. So
we're cautiously optimistic that people will see it as a safe place to go.
Yeah.
As opposed to a jammed-in nightclub.
Yeah, brilliant. Good, thanks. So I'd like to contribute a few things to some of our findings, Jim, and and then David Allen will say a few things. So I think one of the themes that's coming out of our investigations, our discussions, is that there's a new order appearing. And it's interesting that Spain's oldest woman, age 113 today, actually said that she said this. There's a new order appearing. Lord Maurice Glassman said something very similar, and the great Dave Allen said exactly the same, which was around, for the first time in our careers, we actually need a new sort of hat to hang our hat on. I think the other thing I think we're picking up, there's a fairly major misalignment between activity and the challenge. So some of the government actions are creating time. The challenge is, how do we use that time? So I think the challenge is, if the actions are here, where's the challenge, and how closely are those two things aligned? And so I think we've got a great window to do something about this. VCs are, in our experience, beyond the discussions that we've had, I think of really focusing on the refinancing. So, to increase the runway and to, but really not doing a great deal with the leadership teams and or looking at the skills that people actually need to define the new now. So a lot of the paradigms that organisations are faced with are very much as is, and there's not much leadership development going on. And certainly some of our observations around the skills to cope with this and read this are that to close that gap between the actions and the challenge are all around people development. Within this as well, I think we're observing some growth opportunities. So there's a client that we've closely communicating with currently who had a great growth opportunity, but actually is sort of falling to pieces around the level of stress in the business, which is making decision making difficult, the operational issues around going back to work, and declining revenues and uncertainty around revenue, which is making it very difficult for them to establish their plans. I think as well, there's a business I turned around which is tragically up in the aerospace in the northwest, which is a great engineering business, aerospace, really difficult to replace skills. Who've, all of the jobs have gone to France, which I discovered last week. So some really quite tough things taking place, and that's a UK capability which is pretty strategic. I think as well, at a top level, there's definitely a chunk taken out of the economy and of around 20%, and it's pretty common across the globe. And the challenge, I think, with that is, a lot of VCs are not paying each other, and what's the collateral fallout? And certainly from a supply chain perspective, there's some difficult issues in the supply chain because, the Forrester effect, the whiplash that goes down the supply chain, particularly in automotive, when you're running a car part, you've got to have a lot of continuity. Those issues can take about 18 months to work through. And the most difficult turnarounds, I think, I've ever come across is when you've got a soft top line. That makes it very difficult to turn around in terms of making the operational changes. So I think there's a set of paradigms that sit below this, Jim, which are worth reconsidering. And this is something that we're certainly doing to following a period of probably having had it too easy for too long, where leaders are sort of assuming that growth and more is the way to go. And in fact, some of these mantras should be challenged. And there's a real issue around relationships as well, because when things get difficult, and I think things are out of the utopia of, the time out and the quietness and family and stuff, I think now we're in a position where people are getting more concerned, and the level of stress is becoming more difficult to cope with. So there's an issue around skills to read this, and there's an issue around actually getting the strategy right, notwithstanding we don't necessarily know what the future looks like. It's about reading the tea leaves during this process. So I think our focus is very much to get leadership teams together to fix this in one day, to open up these options, because the cash burn or the delaying that can be very costly if a business isn't viable. And you're better off to identify in one day that a business isn't viable rather than even have a slow cash burn over a long period of time, which could be a very costly exercise. And I think there's one big question. It's a question I always ask people when they're doing the job or recruiting, a sign of healthiness. What support does someone need to do their job, which is a sign of self-awareness, because people that tend to suggest that they don't need any help always concern me, because we all need some help in terms of what would enable us to become more successful. So I think that would be my contribution in terms of some of the findings that we've noticed. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, Jim. Any comments on?
I think I think you said it in the introduction. We're a bit different to the typical VC, and we're not big users of debt either. So we didn't have the immediate debt issues that are probably another pandemic across the private equity world. But we did, as you could probably tell from what I was saying earlier on, we did immediately step in and say, okay, the world's changed. What are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
And within a few days, we had our first version of what the new world was going to be like with all of our businesses. And you just absolutely have to move at the kind of speed you're talking about.
Great. Yeah. Okay.
Because otherwise, you'll burn through what reserves you do have.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So, David Allen, although your name badge says Mike Weirs, which is next.
Yeah, Mike Weirs.
You've been promoted, David. So just.
Jim, I actually I find your comments very interesting, particularly vis-a-vis the hospitality business, because last week, as you may know, Airbnb laid off a quarter of its workforce. But even more interesting than that was really two things. One, about 4 weeks before, they took on about $500 million in cash. So they parted with a bunch of equity and stored it all up. Clearly they had a clear plan in mind. But even more interesting was the message from the CEO of Airbnb about what they were doing and why. And he said that the concept of people staying in other people's homes, as we've done it, that's over. That's not going to happen again. He said, however, our infrastructure is made so that new developments like in-service accommodation have all kinds of room for opportunity, because big companies they're not going to be putting their people up in hotels, and people are going to travel. They're generally going to take the path of least resistance in traveling. So whereas before, if they were in Manchester, they would have hopped on a plane and come down here and done their thing. Today they're going to drive. Okay, it's going to be a pain in the ass because they got to drive 8 hours, but they're going to do it anyway. Same thing from Edinburgh and Glasgow and all over the UK, and the same thing, up and down the east coast of the US. They're going to end up doing these same things, pursuing the path of least resistance, and the whole accommodation industry could change very, very quickly because of that. So I found it very interesting. That we are waiting to see what happens, but I do think there's a couple people from my observation, that popped right to the forefront of the parade, like these guys at Airbnb, to think about doing that. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Jim, but that's just my observation.
Yeah, I think that all sounds very sensible. I think one of the big unknowns in this is just how confident people will be to go out and do what they were previously doing.
Yeah, travel at all.
Post all of this. I probably, because of what we do in healthcare, I probably read more about infections than many of the people on this call. And I'm constantly reminded by medical people that there are lots of viruses that we never developed a vaccine for. There is no vaccine for HIV, for example. They haven't developed vaccines for other coronaviruses, so it's not at all clear that we'll end up with a vaccine for this. We might end up with a treatment regime, like has happened with HIV, which might mean that for at least a large chunk of the population, getting the disease is not the end of the world. You're ill for a couple of days and then you're okay again, and mortality rates are tiny. But in the all of that's a long way away. And in the meantime, what people do is, I think it's early to predict. And just one anecdote from China: one of the Western cinema chains opened up when they were allowed to open up. So few people came that they closed 2 weeks later.
Yeah, I think that's
but that's a business that's already on the way out anyway.
Yeah. But nobody knew who'd been sitting in the seat before them. No one knew who touched the door that they just walked through. Nobody came.
I think, Jim, that's what you just touched on there in terms of the vaccines is a really good example of the assumptions that people are using to base their decisions, and how well they're thought through, and how good is the critical thinking. Are people taking the time to challenge things, and is there the framework internally to have those discussions? Is there the healthy dialogue to reach those types of conclusions?
One way I've always found that can help facilitate that is human nature is you tend to want to have one plan, because it's the plan, and then everyone knows what they're doing, and we're all doing the same thing, and we're all doing the plan. In these uncertain times, you have to work to a number of plans, because you don't know there's enough uncertainty, you don't know which plan you're going to end up on.
Yeah.
And in the old days, they used to call it scenario planning. And I really, one tip I pass on is to take that way of thinking. In these uncertain times.
I think it's right. I think it's also about having an environment whereby people, that are interfacing with you, Jim, feel comfortable to say things that they know you won't necessarily like to hear, and fly in the face of what you're thinking, because they might fundamentally disagree, and that can be quite a difficult discussion. And so the challenge is our approachability, and is there the opportunity to have those discussions.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
If you don't know what's going on,
yeah, exactly. So
it's deadly.
Brilliant. So thank you very much, Jim and David. So David number 2, I can't believe we've got 2 Davids on this call, but it always causes a certain amount of confusion. So David McLean, what are your observations in terms of some of the people aspects of what we talked about?
Yeah, it's interesting what you just said there about critical thinking as well, and even clear thinking. What stops clear thinking is fear. It absolutely is fear of the unknown and fear of the uncertainty that's going on at the moment. And thank you for the discussion so far. I really appreciate that and what you were saying, Jim. Some really good points in there. And my observations in terms of the new now, in terms of the people aspect, is that the questions I always have: are people doing enough to survive? They want to be doing enough, but are they doing the right things? And what's stopping them? There is aspects that Jim's obviously touched on, and we all have, in terms of sector specific. There's areas that we can't control. There's some areas that if you work in a specific sector, such as retail, you're in a bit of trouble in aviation. But I always go back to the individual and think, right, what can they do? What areas can you work in? What can you change? How can you change your thinking? A funny old thing. And attitude is certainly a key aspect of that. And it's not to say that people whose businesses are not literally but metaphorically on fire and are trying their absolute hardest to say, oh, you have a really bad attitude, no, you're not doing things right. It's not about giving people into trouble, so to speak, in that way, but it's recognising positively what is their attitude. What is your attitude towards what you're doing? Thoughts, feelings and actions basically is what an attitude comprises of. What are you thinking about? And this is where we come in, of course, because when you're trying your hardest to think about what you're supposed to do, when you're trying your absolute best to be pushing and moving in the right direction, but as we spoke about before, and it's a kind of common statement, you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't know what you're supposed to be doing, then you don't know which direction to be going in. And that's where experts in the fields of knowledge around this, of psychology, of behaviour, human behaviour, can come in and help otherwise known experts in their fields. And I think it's the limiting beliefs, the attitude, the blind spots that people have. None of it is their fault. Remember, if we can have imagined or remind ourselves in terms of how the brain works and how this fear response can hit all of us. It's an evolutionary response. It's not no one's fault. But understanding that, recognising that, and then being able to move forward is absolutely key. And being able to be supported in your thinking as well, and to clear those blind spots is what's really required, I believe, anyway, to be able to move forward.
Thank you very much, David. It's great. Mike, over to you. Well, have we got any questions, David? Anybody in the...
We do. We have a couple of questions, and please, if anyone else has any, then I'll ask. But I'll ask them. They're both for Jim, and the first one is... Jim, this is from Martin Zeman. Jim, are you putting your new investments on hold, brackets, to reserve cash for the existing portfolio, close brackets, or do you see this time as a perfect opportunity to acquire? And if so, where do you see the opportunities?
So we haven't put new investments on hold. What I would say is the experience of the last 2 downturns is we're probably a bit cautious about new investments. Healthcare, I think we would pretty much do something tomorrow, but outside of healthcare, I think we'd be more cautious because, for all the reasons I was saying before, really, investing in a most of consumer and trying to predict where demand for that business is going to go, and therefore where the business is going to go, is pretty difficult at the moment. So that's kind of an it depends answer. And I think, you know, I'm only talking about our two sectors. I think you could probably you probably see exactly the same going on in the rest of the economy. If you're in the right parts of tech, you know, if you are investing in Amazon, Amazon will keep going. If you were in, I don't know what an example would be, but the wrong kind of tech, then things would be uncertain.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you. And the second question is from Steve Wynn. Jim, with interest rates at historic lows, would you fund future acquisitions by borrowing?
So a subject we haven't touched on at all is the lending market. So if you're a bank today, you've probably got pretty much no idea how much bad debt you've got. And if you've got no idea how much bad debt you've got, then you don't know how much capital you've got. And if you don't know how much capital you've got, you don't know how much lending you can do. So whatever they might say on the outside, most banks are pretty much closed for lending. So whatever interest rates are, if you go to a bank, you're not going to have much opportunity. Depending on which, primarily which size bracket you're in. Today, a lot of lending is actually, certainly the bigger ticket lending is done by debt funds. Debt funds are not regulated like banks. They don't have capital requirements. They do have money to lend. Initially, when all of this happened, they shut up shop for lending because they could buy someone else's debt for 50p in the pound. And that seemed like a better deal than going out and issuing new debt at 100p in the pound because there were 4 sellers of debt. That's still the case to some extent. It's wound down a little bit. So they are coming back to lending. But they, you know, a lender is even more faced by the same things I said just now, that, you know, getting a proper handle on the outlook for a business before you lend to it is not completely straightforward.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jim. Really good. Mike, over to you just to wrap things up with your unenviable task of trying to summarize this discussion.
It's actually an extremely good discussion because really what I heard Jim telling us is we're going back to basics. We're focusing on the cash generation of the business, and we're focusing on operations and how operations can be adjusted and should be adjusted given the new normal. And the new normal is seemingly going to be a new habit of the way we interface with each other. So I found that extremely interesting. The need to have a plan, and I think that also feeds into what David McLean was saying. You know, thoughts, actions, and outcomes, or thoughts, feelings, and actions. Because we also need to give our people some understanding of the future, and that planning process in itself enables you to engage people and let them have a stake in this opinion as to where we're going. And that then feeds into teamwork, and the ability to survive and thrive is utterly dependent on that, in my view. Very interesting examples there from David Allen as well about Airbnb's new take on the future. And what that highlights for me is that, you know, I've stayed in a lot of hotels in my life, and very few of them I really enjoyed staying in. And I think that the model of the big hotel has been failing for some time. So now here Airbnb is actually going after a different type of route to have people stay for short periods of time. So I thought this was a very, very interesting session today. Back to basics is what it's saying to me. Be careful of debt. Be careful of debt, I think, is also a subliminal message that we're all hearing nowadays. And cash is as it's always been, is king. But pay special attention to it right now. So Jim, David, thank you very, very much for your thoughts today. Most appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jim. Cheers. Thanks very much, Jim. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers.